One word. That is all it takes sometimes. One word between a mother and her daughter. One word that starts a chain of events that nobody can take back. That word was no.
Some people disappear without warning. No fight. No farewell. No sign that the morning after would look any different from every morning before it. And then there are cases like this one. Cases where, if you look closely enough, the warning was there. It just wasn't in the form anyone expected. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a fight. It was a single word. No. That word came from an 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie. She said it to her daughter. And within days of that conversation, Nancy was gone. Gone from her home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. Gone from the $1 million property she had lived in for decades. Gone from the life she had built, the routine she kept, the church live stream she never missed on Sunday mornings.
Nancy Guthrie said no, and 2 weeks later, she was gone.
Gone in a way so calculated, so deliberate, so methodical, that the people who investigate crimes for a living have spent months trying to untangle it. And they are still working. 3 months into one of the most watched missing persons investigations in the country, the silence from law enforcement is not the silence of a case going cold. It is the silence of a case being built. There is a difference. One sounds like nothing. The other sounds exactly like this. Hi viewers, here is a question that has been asked in comment sections across every platform covering this case, and it deserves a real answer from real people. Do you believe a family member was involved in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance? Yes or no? Drop it below. Because what comes next in this story may change your answer.
Today we are following the money. Because 3 months into this investigation, a financial trail has surfaced that gives this entire case something it did not have before. A reason.
Now, back to Nancy. She was 84 years old. She lived alone. Her house sat in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the Tucson area, a quiet, established community where people knew their neighbors and kept their doors locked out of habit rather than fear. She had a pacemaker. She took medication every night at 10 p.m., medication that the Pima County Sheriff's Office would later describe as critical, the kind that could prove fatal to skip. Every night, before she went to sleep, she removed her hearing aids. And when those came out, the world went completely silent around her. She could not hear a knock. She could not hear a voice. She could not hear anything moving through the rooms of her own home. She was, in every practical sense, unreachable after dark. No active security cameras. No alarm system. No medical alert device on her wrist or around her neck. No overnight caretaker sleeping in the next room. The dog she once had was gone, and no replacement had ever come.
A documented, sequenced, undeniable financial picture that runs from May of 2025 all the way to the morning Annie Guthrie called 911.
The camera system existed, but it was not actively recording. A subscription that cost roughly $15 a month. Unpaid. Inactive. Dark. Think about that for a moment. $15. That is the distance between an 84-year-old woman being monitored and being completely exposed. And nobody closed that gap. Not for months. Not while she lived alone in a house worth $1 million, for miles from her daughter's front door. Her daughter, Annie Guthrie. Annie and her husband, Tommaso Sion, lived close enough to be there in under 10 minutes on any given night. Close enough to drop in unannounced. Close enough that if something had ever gone wrong, a phone call and a short drive was all it would have taken to reach Nancy before that wrong became irreversible. But something else happened first. Before the disappearance.
A publication called Hayden Times reported that Annie Guthrie asked her mother Nancy for a loan in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. Nancy reportedly said no.
Before the masked figure photographed at Nancy's front door at 1:47 in the morning. Before the pacemaker signal that blinked off at 2:28 a.m. and never came back. Before any of that, there was a conversation between a mother and her daughter. A request was made. A specific request. Financial in nature. Annie reportedly asked Nancy for a loan, and Nancy said no. That detail, first reported by Hidden Times, has not been confirmed by law enforcement. It has not been publicly addressed by the Guthrie family. It has not been denied. It simply sits there, at the beginning of a sequence of events that ends with an empty house, a sealed 911 call, and a federal investigation that a retired detective says is heading toward a trial. Heading toward a trial. Not a dead end. Not a cold file. A trial. Somewhere between that word, no, and the moment Nancy's pacemaker went dark in the early hours of February 1st, something happened. Something was decided. And the forensic evidence now being analyzed by one of the most sophisticated laboratories in the country suggests that whoever made that decision left something behind inside Nancy's home. Something biological. Something that has already been run through the National DNA database and come back with a result that investigators have not made public, but that sources familiar with the case describe as deeply significant. Not because it identified a stranger. Because it described someone who had been in that house before. The full picture of what those results reveal, what the sealed 911 call contains, what 40 days of forensic examination on Annie's vehicle uncovered, and what the photographs of boxes leaving Nancy's home while she is still legally alive and still legally the owner of that property actually mean, that is what this story is about. Because Nancy Guthrie did not simply vanish. She was taken. Precisely. Deliberately. By someone who knew exactly how vulnerable she was after dark. Someone who knew the layout of that house. Someone who knew when she would be alone, when her hearing aids would be out, when the cameras would show nothing. And the question that has haunted this case from the very beginning, the question that every piece of documented evidence keeps circling back to, is not how. It is who. Stay with this. Because the answer is closer than anyone has said out loud. Follow the money. That is what investigators are trained to do when the emotional noise of a case gets too loud and the facts start blurring together. Strip everything back. Remove the grief, remove the speculation, remove the headlines. And follow the money. Because money does not lie. Money does not forget. And in the case of Nancy Guthrie, the money tells a story that is very difficult to explain away. Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills is valued at approximately $1 million. Public record. Sitting in one of the most sought-after neighborhoods in the Tucson area. A property she had owned for decades. A property that represented not just her life, but her legacy. For miles away, Annie and Tommaso Sion owned their own home. Valued at approximately $650,000. A gap of roughly $350,000 between the mother's home and the daughter who lived nearest to her. On its own, that gap means nothing. Parents often accumulate more than their children. That is completely ordinary. But when you are trying to understand why someone would target Nancy specifically, why this woman, why this house, why a level of planning so precise and so deliberate that it required surveillance, specific timing, and complete knowledge of her nightly routine, the value of what she owned becomes directly relevant. Because the most common motive when an elderly person is harmed by someone within their own circle is never rage. It is never passion. It is access. Access to assets that become available when the owner is no longer present to protect them. Then there is the power of attorney. In May of 2025, 8 months before Nancy disappeared, Tommaso Sion signed a durable power of attorney naming Annie as his agent over financial and property matters. Legal professionals who reviewed it publicly called it standard. The kind of document that gets signed during a mortgage refinance or a property transfer. Routine paperwork. Nothing more. Maybe. But the timing places it inside a sequence. And that sequence has a direction. May 2025, power of attorney signed. Sometime before January 31st, Annie reportedly asks Nancy for a loan. The amount is unknown. The reason is unknown. Nancy says no. January 31st, Nancy has dinner at Annie and Tommaso's home. Tommaso drives her back. February 1st, Nancy is gone. Dismiss any single item in isolation and it means nothing. But the sequence does not exist in isolation. It exists as a continuous line. And that line points in one direction. Financial. Now consider the vulnerability that surrounded Nancy in the final weeks of her life. No active cameras. No alarm. No caretaker. No medical alert. The dog that once provided both companionship and a layer of awareness was gone and never replaced. Every single one of those missing protections costs almost nothing to restore. A camera monitoring subscription, $15 a month. A medical alert pendant, less than $1 a day. An overnight home health aide in the Tucson area, a few $100s a week. A phone call and a credit card. That is the entire barrier between an 84-year-old woman being protected and being completely exposed. The Guthrie family had the resources. Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's other daughter, is one of the highest-paid journalists in broadcast television. The combined income across the adult siblings more than covered every one of those protections many times over without any meaningful financial impact on anyone. And none of it was done. Now factor in the reported loan refusal. If Annie was in a financial position where she needed to ask her 84-year-old mother for money and was turned down, then the question of why no one invested in basic protections for Nancy takes on an entirely different weight. It is no longer simply an oversight. It becomes a situation that someone under financial pressure may not have seen as a priority worth addressing. Or it becomes something more deliberate than that. A vulnerable, unmonitored, unprotected mother in a $1 million home is significantly easier to reach than one surrounded by cameras, motion sensors, and a caretaker sleeping down the hall. That is not speculation. That is the logic that experienced investigators apply when they encounter this specific combination of factors in any case involving an elderly victim. And then the boxes started leaving. Photographs surfaced in the weeks following Nancy's disappearance showing people at her residence loading items into vehicles. Annie's Honda CR-V was visible in those images. Boxes being carried out of the home of a woman who has not been declared dead. No death certificate. No probate process initiated. No court order authorizing the removal of a single item from a property that is still the subject of an active federal investigation. And yet the boxes left. There is no confirmed plan that Annie and Tommaso intended to move into Nancy's home. But between the boxes, the repeated presence of Annie's vehicle, and the documented familiarity with which Tommaso had already been observed moving through the house and garage on the same day ransom notes surfaced publicly, people began connecting dots. And the picture those dots formed was a family preparing to assume control of a property whose owner had not been declared dead because the law had not yet reached that conclusion. That is not a minor detail. That is not something that can be set aside. If someone is removing property from the home of a missing person whose disappearance remains an active federal case, law enforcement is almost certainly aware. The fact that it continued without any public intervention tells you one of two things. Either investigators are watching and documenting rather than stopping it. Or there is an explanation that has not been made public. Neither possibility is reassuring. Now step into the night of January 31st. Not as a timeline. As a room. As a dinner table. As a car ride home along a dark road where no camera followed and no record was made. At 5:32 in the evening, Nancy requested an Uber from her residence. The driver picked her up and took her to Annie and Tommaso's home. That ride is fully documented. Timestamps, in-car footage, a driver who cooperated with the FBI. Everything about the trip to Annie's house is on the record. The trip home is not. Nancy did not take an Uber back. Tommaso drove her. He decided when they left. He chose the route. He determined the moment Nancy reached her front door. And his account of those final minutes, walking her inside, watching the garage door close behind her, stands completely alone. No camera recorded the arrival. No neighbor witnessed it. No app generated a timestamp. The only version of what happened in those last minutes before Nancy was alone in her home comes from one person. At 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera captured a figure at Nancy's front door. Balaclava. Double gloves. Standing with the kind of stillness that comes from preparation, not panic. This was not impulsive. This was not random. Every element of that approach, the covered face, the covered hands, the specific timing, reflected a person who had thought carefully about what they were doing and had decided to do it anyway. At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from her phone. The device that had been syncing to the nightstand beside her bed went silent. She had been moved. Taken beyond Bluetooth range of the phone she left behind. And then, nothing. No call from Annie. No text from Tommaso. No drive across those 4 miles to check on a woman they had just spent an entire evening with. A woman with a pacemaker. A woman whose medication, if missed, the sheriff's office described as potentially fatal. A woman who, from the moment her hearing aids came out at night, was completely cut off from the world around her. From 9:50 in the evening until 12:03 the following afternoon, 14 hours and 13 minutes, there was total silence from the people who knew her best, lived closest, and had been the last to see her. 14 hours. In families where a parent lives alone and is aging, the good night check is automatic. The morning text is routine. It costs nothing. It takes 3 seconds. And it exists because people who love someone cannot help but reach out. That habit was completely absent on the night of January 31st. Its absence created the exact window that whoever took Nancy required. No unexpected phone call. No unplanned visit. No interruption of any kind. Just a clean, unbroken block of time in which the only way to discover that something had gone wrong was a friend who noticed an empty chair on a Sunday morning church live stream. That friend made the call that Annie did not. At 11:56 in the morning on February 1st, the family arrived at Nancy's residence. At 12:03 in the afternoon, the 911 call was placed. 7 minutes passed between those 2 moments. 7 minutes between arriving at the home of a missing 84-year-old woman and picking up a phone. What happened in those 7 minutes? Were they moving through the house? Were they calling each other? Were they standing in front of something visible on the front porch, something that required a conversation before anyone dialed? That 911 call was made by Annie. It has never been released. Not the recording. Not a transcript. Not even a summary of how it began or what was said. In Arizona, 911 recordings are public records. In high-profile missing persons cases, they typically surface within days. Sometimes within hours. 3 months into this investigation, no one has heard what Annie said when she called to report her mother was gone. Retired Detective Bob Gilheim, speaking publicly on an interview program, addressed this directly. He said the recording almost certainly contains investigative information that law enforcement does not want heard yet. He said not to hold your breath waiting for it. And then he said the word that changed the entire shape of this story. Trial. He said that recording may not surface until a trial date approaches. A trial. That word is not used carelessly by someone with decades of investigative experience. A trial implies charges. It implies an arrest. It implies that despite 3 months of public silence, despite the careful language from law enforcement, despite the apparent stillness on the surface of this case, the trajectory underneath leads to a courtroom. And the 911 call is being saved for that moment. Think about what might be on the recording that justifies keeping it sealed this long. Not just the voice, not just the time. The details volunteered before the dispatcher even asked. The description of what was seen. the emotional register of someone arriving at a scene for what they claim is the first time. Background sounds. Other voices in the space. All of it locked away. All of it being preserved. For trial. Annie's Honda CR-V was seized by law enforcement and held for over 40 days of forensic examination. 40 days. Standard vehicle processing in a missing persons case takes days, not weeks. 40 days is the timeline of a vehicle being examined with a specific objective. A specific material being searched for. Trace evidence. Biological evidence. Something that required time, precision, and the kind of laboratory work that does not rush. A vehicle held for 40 days belonging to someone who has been publicly described as not a suspect is one of the quieter details in this case. But it is one of the loudest. Then came the DNA result. A hair sample was recovered from inside Nancy's home. That sample was sent, initially, to a private laboratory in Florida. It has since been connected to a San Francisco laboratory that specializes in forensic genetic genealogy, the same discipline, the same technology, that identified Rex Human as the Long Island serial killer after decades of the case sitting unsolved. That technology does not guess. It does not estimate. It builds a family tree from a strand of biological material and works backward through generations until it arrives at a living person. It takes time. It requires patience. But when the biological evidence is intact, when the sample contains a route that allows for full genomic profiling, it does not fail. The CODIS search, the National Criminal DNA Database, came back with no match. No match does not mean no answer. It means the person who left that hair inside Nancy's home has never been in the criminal justice system. No prior arrests. No prior convictions. A completely clean record. An ordinary name. An ordinary life. Someone who, if described to a neighbor or a colleague, would generate no alarm whatsoever. Someone unremarkable on paper. Someone who could attend a family dinner. Someone who could sign legal documents and conduct real estate transactions and ask an elderly mother for a loan. Someone who had been inside that house before and knew it well enough to move through it in the dark. That is the profile the evidence describes. Not a stranger. Not a career offender. Someone known. Someone trusted. Someone whose name would not trigger a single flag in any database, because until now, they had never been caught. Dr. Matthew Hines, vice chair of the Pima County Board of Supervisors, made a public accusation against Sheriff Chris Nanos. He stated directly that Nanos had hindered cooperation with the FBI due to a personal grudge against the Bureau. A sitting elected official, within the county's own government, made that accusation on the record. It has not been retracted. That is not routine interagency friction. That is a formal allegation that the lead investigator on a federal missing persons case allowed personal history to interfere with finding an 84-year-old woman. Ed Smart, the father of Elizabeth Smart, a man who has lived through exactly this kind of nightmare and understands better than almost anyone what these investigations look like from the inside, appeared publicly and chose his words with visible, deliberate care. He said the Guthrie family has supposedly been cleared. Supposedly. That word was not accidental. That word was the entire statement. And then there is NBC. Savannah Guthrie's employer built a specific internal protocol for this case. If news about Nancy breaks during a live broadcast, Savannah is removed from the set immediately. A different anchor delivers the story on camera. The information reaches Savannah privately, off-air. That protocol was reportedly activated on April 15th. Savannah was pulled mid-broadcast. She returned without explanation. 2 days later, she was absent from the show entirely. Networks do not build those kinds of internal systems for cases they believe are going nowhere. They build them for cases where they expect a specific moment. An arrest. A discovery. An identification that will land in real time during a live national broadcast. The existence of that protocol is its own form of preparation. And preparation signals expectation. Now pull every thread together. One final time. Beginning to end. May 2025. A durable power of attorney is signed, giving Annie authority over Tommaso's financial and property affairs. 8 months before Nancy disappears. Sometime before January 31st, Annie reportedly asks Nancy for a loan. Nancy says no. January 31st, Nancy takes a documented Uber to Annie's home for dinner. Later that night, Tommaso drives her back in a trip with no documentation, no camera, no witness, and only one account of what happened at the door. For the next 14 hours, there is no contact of any kind from the people 4 miles away. February 1st, a masked figure approaches in the early morning hours. Nancy's pacemaker goes dark before sunrise. At noon, the 911 call is placed, and it is immediately sealed by investigators. A retired detective says it contains evidence bound for a courtroom. Annie's vehicle is seized and held for 40 days of forensic examination. Photographs emerge of boxes leaving Nancy's home while she is still legally alive and legally the owner of that property. The DNA recovered from inside the house belongs to someone with no criminal record. Someone ordinary. Someone familiar. Each item in that sequence carries an innocent explanation. That is worth acknowledging directly and clearly. A power of attorney can be routine. A dinner is just a dinner. A gap in phone calls can be an oversight. Boxes can be moved for preservation. Every single piece of this has a version that means nothing on its own. But here is the truth that this case keeps returning to. When every innocent explanation requires ignoring what came before it and what comes after it, when accepting each one in isolation demands pretending the sequence does not exist, those explanations stop being the most likely ones. They become the ones you have to work the hardest to believe. Nancy Guthrie was not taken randomly. She was not chosen by chance. She was taken by someone who knew exactly where she lived, exactly how she lived, and exactly what window of time existed in which no one would come looking. Someone said no to her daughter. And within days of that conversation, everything Nancy had spent a lifetime building sat at the center of a federal investigation. The forensic genetic genealogy analysis is not finished. The 911 call is still sealed. The full results of what 40 days inside Annie's vehicle produced have not been disclosed. And somewhere in a laboratory, a strand of biological material recovered from inside a missing woman's home is in the process of being traced back to a family tree. Back to a name. Back to someone who has been living an ordinary life while investigators quietly close the distance. The reward for information leading to Nancy's safe return remains $1,200,000. If you know anything about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department at 520-351-4900 or reach out directly to the FBI. Because this case is not over. It is not cold. It is not stalled. It is building. And in the next video, there is one detail that has not been discussed publicly in full. One piece of the forensic picture that, when placed alongside the DNA result and the sealed 911 call, reframes the entire timeline of the night Nancy disappeared. It does not just suggest who was involved. It speaks directly to how this was planned and how far in advance the planning began. That video is already waiting. And once you hear what was found, the dinner on January 31st will never look the same way again.